Let's take a look at smoothing, and then that will free us up to looking at the actual settings of a brush and how those work. So smoothing just seems to be an on-off button, but if we look up at our options bar, we'll see that there's a little more going on. For whatever reason, Photoshop didn't simply provide the smoothing percentage and smoothing options, which is a little gear icon, on a smoothing window inside the brushes palette. Instead, you're reliant on all of this up here in your options bar. Such is life. So turning smoothing off will simply remove smoothing. Now, that doesn't really help if you don't know what smoothing is. Let's zoom in a bit. Switch to the brush, shrink it down. Now, see these little wibbles and wobbles? That's from me using my mouse. It jerks around a little bit as I paint. If I were to turn on smoothing, notice that the wibbles and wobbles now appear to be gone, or at least greatly reduced. Have an idea of what smoothing is doing now? It's attempting to get rid of abnormalities in a brush stroke. Now, the way that it does that differs depending on a few things. First of all, if you have smoothing on, but you reduce smoothing to 0%, it's not the same as having smoothing off. Notice that it's still a smoother stroke than the original smoothing off stroke, and in fact, I would argue it's a smoother stroke than the smoothing at 10% stroke. What's going on here is that Photoshop used to have a single smoothing algorithm that worked great. And by default, it was just kind of on. And so if you do a brush stroke, it would work, and if you turned it off, it would leave things be, and it wouldn't touch it. When they switched over to having different smoothing options available on this pop-out window, drop-down gear icon, they replaced the standard smoothing algorithm. But they did hide it, so you can still get the legacy smoothing algorithm. Simply turn smoothing on, then reduce smoothing to 0%. So let's crank this up to 10% for a moment. Let's change the color to something else. And let's take a look at what it's doing here. If we go to a flyout, we can see the flyout menu here. We can see that we can actually check multiple pieces. We have, by default, adjust for zoom and stroke catch up. Now, what's cool is this little tooltip will pop up and try to explain what it's talking about. Adjust for zoom, if you wait a moment, of course, it could also just disappear because this is a Windows 10 and it doesn't always keep track of stuff. That one's not on Adobe. Oh well, I'll just explain it then. Fortunately, I have written everything down. Adjust for zoom attempts to correct the jitteriness of a stroke, which we've seen here with no smoothing whatsoever. I'll just call that the jitteriness of the stroke going on there. It tries to correct the jitteriness of the stroke by a different amount depending on how zoomed in you are. So in other words, if you are zoomed out very far, a small distance, a small distance. A small stroke will go a long way across the page because you're zoomed out a lot. But with see how smooth this is, how incredibly smooth this is? What's happening is that when you have the adjust for zoom on, when you zoom out, it increases smoothing. When you zoom in, it decreases zooming. It assumes that you know what you're doing if you've zoomed in that far. So you can see the slight wobble right around here on the right side. So that's all that does. So one more time, zooming in decreases the smoothing, zooming out increases the smoothing. And you can learn more about that right on Adobe's website. If you look that up, that's where I got this, but word for word, that's what they said. So I often get it mixed up. I would think that zooming out would decrease and zooming in would increase, but that's not the case. It's actually the other way around. Zoom out to increase smoothing, zoom in to decrease smoothing. So I just looked it up before I recorded this video. Make sure I didn't get it wrong. That's the last thing I want to do is tell you guys some misinformation because I half remembered something. All right, change the color again, switch back to brush. So what are these other ones? We have pulled string mode, catch up on stroke end, and catch up and stroke catch up mode. Well, if we check pulled string mode, it will get rid of or ghost out the stroke catch up mode and the catch up stroke on stroke end. So in the pull string mode, this one's pretty cool. So we've got our snail, right? When I start drawing, you see this weird circle that pops up? When I draw outside of the circle will drag along like a pull toy, like a little string, and it will create the stroke, the little paint stroke. But if I move within the circle, it won't calculate a new stroke. So I can do tight angle turns perfectly inside of here. And I'm just using a mouse and not even using the Wacom tool. But that means that I have some leeway with what I'm doing, which can be kind of interesting sometimes. This is, I found to be most useful if you're trying to do some hand-drawn text and you want to get it just right. You can make a sharp G, for example, and that sort of thing right within it. And it gives you good turns. So you can do an E. And you can have a little hand-drawn stroke with different kinds of angles in it, depending on what you're doing. That's about it. So I don't know. I think it's kind of neat. You can crank up the smoothing a whole lot. And notice that it starts to misbehave at 100%. If we bring it down to 50, now you can see why. It's changing the size of the circle. So if we crank it up to 100, why is it not doing anything? Zoom out a whole lot. The circle's huge, which allows you to make very controlled strokes, assuming you're zoomed enough for it to actually move the circle around. Again, good for hand lettering. Very strange effect. It feels odd to paint with it. All right, so I wanted to show you that one. Let me turn that off. And now we have stroke catch up and catch up on stroke end. These do two different things. The catch up on stroke end completes the stroke from the last position point where you released the mouse, or when you've released the Cintiq or tablet or touchscreen or whatever when you click up. So let me go ahead and grab another color real quick. So let's just clear this out for a second. And I'll turn this off. All right. So in other words, if we have it set only to stroke catch up on end of stroke, notice how my little dot here has gone past it. If I release, it'll stroke all the way over. So it's doing smoothing calculations, but it isn't necessarily going everywhere until, or going everywhere. It isn't necessarily completing those calculations until I release. I find this aggravating and I hate it. So just to let you know, let's lower the smoothing. If you have it on a smaller amount, you won't have that lag. So see how it doesn't have to go as far when it does the smoothing to do the calculations. Yeah, so I've yet to find a reason to use this. I think it has to do if you have slower machines, it can prevent the stroke itself from taking forever and being laggy, because it will simply do it when you complete it, but it's also harder to see what you're doing, so it's annoying to me. The other one, we pop out to this smoothing options again, is stroke catch up. Notice that while I was holding still, it was trying to complete the stroke. That's all that is. And we'll see this better if we really crank up the smoothing. So it's applying a heavy smoothing. It's doing the calculations as best it can, and then it finally catches up with the brush. So what does it mean to have more or less smoothing? It's how much it's being applied, potentially. We saw that it can behave differently in different smoothing options. For example, the pulled string mode is simply increasing or decreasing the size of the circle of ignorance, I guess you could call it, where it will ignore what you're doing. The dead zone, I guess is another way you could put it. With these, it depends on how it's calculating, and honestly, I'm not sure with this current algorithm. The legacy one was simple enough. If you had jitter beyond a certain amount of threshold, so if, for example, you drew a line, it would try to determine, hey, anything above and below this is probably incorrect and we should smooth it out so that it will be a smoother line altogether. So it would get rid of little bumplets. How much smoothing is occurring, how gracious it is to things like a curve, is dependent on the amount, or at least it's supposed to be. Again, they might have changed it in this current version, or even if they have an update between the time that I record this video and you watch this video. So it really, really benefits you to play with it a little bit and get a feel for it, because it could change. So me saying what it does could be different from how it actually is. But notice now with a lower smoothing, when I make a circle, how angular it is. With a higher smoothing, it tries to curve that better. It's guessing based off of what I was doing, the motion, the end motion, where it should really be earlier in time. So hence part of the delay is doing calculations. It's fiddling things around. Now, programs other than Photoshop could use smoothing in completely different ways. It's perfectly capable. Some software, for example, when you finish drawing the line, it will suddenly bounce it around so that it tries to make a straighter line. Whereas Photoshop tries to calculate it as you're drawing, unless of course you have the catch up on stroke end, and you can do them both. You can see it trying its best, but look how smooth those loops become, as compared with the catches ups off. It's not quite as smooth. It's trying to calculate it more quickly. So that's the trade-off. You have an annoying lag, but that means it's calculating the motion. And if you're just doing straight lines, you don't really need that. If you're doing a lot of curves, you might want that. Honestly, unless you're doing curves, I don't think smoothing is all that necessary. Your hand will improve over time if you don't use smoothing, just because you're practicing. And you'll get better and better at it, and eventually you won't need it. If you always leave smoothing on at a fairly high amount, it will inhibit your growth. So watch out for that. However, as brushes go, sometimes you'll want that because they may react differently to different amounts of motion. Simply because of the way that you have jitters and things set, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But the important bit to remember is that if you turn the flow to 0%, sorry, the flow, what am I doing? If you turn the smoothing to 0%, the smoothing to 0%, it will use the legacy version of smoothing if smoothing's on. If you uncheck smoothing, it won't use any smoothing whatsoever, and you can hopefully see how wiggly a smoothing off is even compared to the legacy smoothing. Legacy smoothing, I think, is one of the gentlest smoothings. So a lot of times it will be better if you're learning how to digitally paint. On the other hand, I've seen a lot of people be very, very, very happy with having a smoothing of like 10, 20%, 15% in there, and just have stroke catch up and adjust for zoom. And at a lower percentage, it doesn't need to do as many calculations, so we'll do it more on the fly. At the higher percentage, it needs to know where you're going. Like, oh, is this going to be a sharp angle somewhere? Then I'm going to need to change how I'm smoothing it. It's going to be a gentle curve. That's going to change how it's smoothing. It changes the way that the algorithm is affecting your stroke, essentially. And with those off, it doesn't really affect it as well. I like adjust for zoom if you're using smoothing. Honestly, the defaults are pretty good if you're going to be using smoothing. But do fiddle with this stuff anytime that you're checking, anytime you're doing a painting, you want to check to see if there's a better way to do it. All right, so that's smoothing. I'll see you in the next video, and we'll start talking about the brush tip shape, the shape dynamics, and all that good stuff. All right, see you in a minute.